Happy Father's Day to everyone that is a father. Happy Father's Day. As you can see, we got VBS coming up. We've got like a few more days. If you would like to register a student for VBS, you can do that. Just grab one of the QR codes on the way out. They're on the table in the foyer out there. For all the decorations and all that, I want to say thank you to all the decorators, the decorating team. It looks absolutely awesome. Good job, guys. I appreciate that. So thank you for that. We are in the final week of our series, God Among Us. As we walk through the life of Jesus, we started this, Christmas of last year, actually. And it's going to end Easter of next year. So it's a pretty long series. But we got these little mini series, and we're talking about God among us. Jesus showing himself to be God, kind of taking peeks at his divinity. And today is the ultimate peek at his divinity. We're going to be talking about transfiguration today. But before we get to that, it's in Matthew. So open up to Matthew 17. That's where we're going to be. But before we get to that, I'm sure all of y'all are like me, where you look back on your life and you can find kind of like chapters in your life, right? Those defining moments within your life. We probably all look back and we're like, well, my life from birth to high school was like this. And from, graduating high school to college and career, it kind of looked like this. And from my career on to whatever else, retirement, wherever you may be in that spectrum. And there's little things that kind of come along the way and kind of help set those chapters a little bit more defined. You may have gotten married and you're like, well, okay, that kind of sets a new path for my life. Maybe unfortunately you've been divorced. That sets a new path for your life. You have children. That definitely sets a new path for your life. Maybe you've had a child or other loved ones die. That sets a path for your life. So there's these little markers along the way that we can just kind of hang our hat on, or if you're reading a book, you're like, okay, that's a new chapter now, and I'm going to move on. Jesus was the same way. When we experience the life of Jesus through this series, there are different things that kind of set different markers in the life of Jesus. We looked at Jesus from his birth to his baptism. We know an awful lot about his birth because of Matthew and Luke. We don't know much about his early life when he was growing up in Nazareth. We know his 12-year-old incident down in Jerusalem, but we don't know much about him becoming a young man. We don't know when Joseph passed away or anything like that. But those were events within the life of Jesus that for him were markers. And then we get to his baptism. And basically from his baptism to what is today the transfiguration that we're going to focus on is a different chapter in the life of Jesus. Throughout this time of his baptism to his transfiguration, he's focused a lot of his ministry up in what is known as Galilee, up in Capernaum, up around the Sea of Galilee. That's where we've been the past 4 or 5 weeks in this little series here, is in that area. And this part of his ministry is heavily weighted towards miracles. He is doing a lot of miracles. Water to wine, raising people from the dead. He's causing the lame to walk. He's doing a whole bunch of different miracles to show who he is. After today, basically from the transfiguration on, he'll still be doing some miracles, but he focuses his ministry more towards Jerusalem. He's moving things towards Jerusalem, and he goes from miracles to teaching. So going forward, we're going to have a lot more teachings of Jesus that we're going to be going through. But all that is because of this chapter break in Jesus' life known as the Transfiguration. Okay? So book of Matthew, go ahead and open up to that, if you would, please. We're actually going to back up from chapter 17 and be in chapter 16. What has happened, at least throughout our series up to this point, like I said, Jesus has been focusing his ministry around what is known as the Sea of Galilee. He's been north of the Sea of Galilee. He's been south of the Sea of Galilee. He went from the east to the west. He has been all over the Sea of Galilee performing different miracles. When he was on the north side, he raised Jairus' daughter from the dead. He healed a lady that had been bleeding for 12 years. He fed 5,000 people. Down on the south side, the other side, where all the Gentiles were, he cast a demon out of this guy, and 2,000 pigs jumped off a cliff. He came back and he went over to the other side where he did more teachings and more healings. And in the middle of all that, he calmed one really wicked storm that had the disciples scared for their lives just by saying, "Peace, be still." And then at another time, he walked on the water in the middle of a storm. And as soon as he got in the boat, everything calmed down. And the disciples looked at him and said, "That's the Son of God." And it's because of that identity of that's the Son of God that I think Jesus took his 12, the 12 disciples, and went up north to an area called Caesarea Philippi for a little retreat. And when he was up north in Caesarea Philippi, he set the disciples down, and they were all hanging out. And he said, "Guys, let me ask you something. Who do people say that I am?" He was just kind of getting a pulse of where things were at. And the disciples were like, "Well, some people say that you're a prophet. Some people say you're like Jeremiah, Elijah. Some people just say you're a prophet." And he says, "Well, what about you? Who do you guys say that I am?" And picking up in Matthew 16, starting in verse 16, it reads, "Simon Peter answered, 'You are the Messiah,' or yours may say the Christ, 'the Son of the living God.' And Jesus replied, 'You are blessed, Simon, son of John, because my Father in heaven has revealed this to you. You did not learn this from any human being.'" That was the end of one chapter. From his baptism to that confession, Jesus' whole focus on his ministry, the whole focus on his teaching, the whole focus on all the miracles he was doing was to get the disciples and others around him to understand who he was. That he was, in fact, the Messiah, the anointed one of God. He was God's Son. And so finally, the disciples understand his identity. But even in understanding his identity, they didn't really understand his mission. They get that he's the Messiah. And when they read the prophets, they understand the Messiah is the prophet to come in the person like Moses. They understand that the Messiah to come is the king to come in a person like David. That he's going to be the one that's going to bring everything back to peace the way it should be. He's going to be the one that establishes Israel, gets rid of all the Roman oppression, gets rid of all the problems. He's the Messiah. That's what they think being Messiah means. And so we pick up in verse 21. From then on, so that's the chapter break in Jesus' life. From then on, Jesus began to tell his disciples plainly that it was necessary or that he must go to Jerusalem and that he would suffer many terrible things at the hands of the elders and the leading priests and the teachers of religious law. He'd be killed, but on the third day, he would be raised from the dead. So Jesus had just concluded the chapter of his identity of him being Messiah, and now he's into a new chapter saying, this is why I've come. I know why you think I've come. I know what the prophets say, but this is why I've come. I have to go to Jerusalem. The cross is where I'm going. And the disciples had a hard time wrapping their head around that. Verse 22, but Peter took him aside and he began to reprimand him. So there's that. He began to reprimand him for saying such things. Heaven forbid, Lord, he said, this will never happen to you. What Peter's saying is, hold up, Jesus, time out. We know who you are. We know you're Messiah. We know that you're the Son of God. We know that you've come to get rid of the Romans and to make everything right, and we're on your side. That is absolutely awesome. And now you're saying you're going to go die? That is not going to happen. We're not going to let that happen. And there becomes this almost possessiveness of Peter about Jesus being Messiah. Yeah, we get your Messiah, we get your God, but you're my Messiah. I'm the one that gets to say what you get to do with that title. And Jesus is like, oh no. Jesus turned to Peter and he said, get away from me, Satan. You're a dangerous trap to me. You're seeing things merely from a human point of view, not from God's. It's really interesting, besides calling him Satan. He tells him to get away because he's only seeing things from a human point of view, not from God's. We're back up in verse 17. When Peter said, you're the Messiah, the Son of God, Jesus congratulates him. He encourages him by saying, you know what? You've learned that from my Father, not from man. But here, when Peter wants to take possession of Jesus' messiahship, he says, hold up, you're seeing this thing from man's view, not from God's. Whenever we come into relationship with Christ, when we understand that Jesus is the Messiah, he is the Savior of our life, let's keep our perspective straight to understand things from God's point of view, not from ours. Let's not lose focus on what Jesus' true identity is. And Jesus said to his disciples, if any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way, take up your cross and follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you'll lose it, but if you give up your life for my sake, you'll save it. And what do you benefit if you gain the whole world, but you lose your soul? Is anything worth more than your soul? For the Son of Man will come with his angels in the glory of his Father and will judge all people according to their deeds. And I tell you the truth, some of you standing right here now will not die before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. If any of you wants to be my follower, it'd be nice if every once in a while you'd give up something you don't like. And if you want to take up a cross, that's cool. And follow me a little bit. It's not the way that reads. Jesus just gets done reprimanding Peter for reprimanding him. He says, listen, if you want to be my follower, you believe that I'm the Messiah, the Son of God, and you want to be my follower, I'm telling you right now, I must go to Jerusalem and die and be raised from the dead. And you want to follow me? This is what you must do. You must deny yourself. Not just give up the bad things that you don't like in your life. You deny yourself. I talk to people all the time about personal relationships, and it's so funny because they're like, oh, they're just so controlling. Guess what? Jesus is controlling. You give up your desires. If this is a wedding and you've got a unity candle, a lot of times they have the unity candle, they got the two side candles, and depending on how the preacher does it, they're like, okay, light the unity candles, but keep your two side candles lit because they represent your individual personalities, even though you're united. It's not the way Jesus works it. If you're in a wedding ceremony of Jesus and you got a unity candle, you're blowing your candle out. You are dying to yourself. Not just little bits. All of it. You're taking up your cross. There's some argument about what that means. Does that mean that you're willing to face persecution and martyrdom? Yeah, if you're following Jesus, you will, but I don't think that's exactly where he's going. I think it's just, again, a reinforcement of you die to yourself. You don't get a say-so in bargaining with Jesus. You either drop to your knee and proclaim him Lord, or you don't. And if you drop to your knee and proclaim him Lord, then you follow him where he goes. Even if that means that Messiah is going to Jerusalem. That's the point Jesus was making to his disciples. You guys got it right when I asked you, who am I? And you came to the conclusion that I'm the Son of God, that I'm the Messiah. Now, if you want to follow me, drop everything and let's go. So I would ask, where are we at? How many of us came to Christ and were like, Jesus, I want you to get rid of my sins. I mean, that's great. And if you can take away some of the bad stuff, that's even better. But other than that, I got it covered. It's not what he's called us to. He has called us to a life of denying ourselves and following him. That's the challenge. Now, 6 days later, Jesus took Peter and the two brothers, James and John, and he led them up a high mountain to be alone. It's interesting, they went up a mountain, and it's debated what mountain this is. Some say it was Mount Hermon, some say it was Mount Tabor. It really doesn't matter what mountain it was, but they went up a mountain. You know, God isn't just a God of mountaintops, but when God meets people throughout the scriptures, we find him usually meeting them on mountaintops. If he has something important to do or to say or to show, oftentimes it's on mountaintops. Think about Abraham. Abraham was told, Abraham, you're going to sacrifice your son, Isaac. Take him up to this mountain, to Mount Moriah. And it was there as Abraham was about ready to sacrifice his son, God stopped him through an angel, said, don't do that. That same mountain, Mount Moriah, is where David bought a threshing floor to appease God through a sacrifice because an angel was set to destroy Jerusalem, and they end up building the temple of God on Mount Moriah. On a mountain, after Moses had led the people of Israel out of slavery in Egypt, God met with Moses to deliver the law on Mount Sinai. Prophet Elijah was facing idolatry in the nation of Israel, and he called the prophets of Baal up to Mount Carmel, where God revealed that he was the true God and killed a whole bunch of prophets of Baal. After he did that, Queen Jezebel said, I'm going to kill you, Elijah, because I like those guys. And so Elijah went running and ran to Mount Carmel, or Mount Sinai, ran to Mount Sinai, the same mountain that God had met Moses. And it was there that God reaffirmed Elijah's calling. There's something about God and mountains in the Bible. So 6 days later, Jesus takes his disciples. They head up this mountain. And as the men watched, Jesus' appearance was transformed so that his face shone like the sun and his clothes became as white as light. We're told in the Exodus account that as Moses would go into the tent of meeting, the tabernacle, and he would meet with God, that after he would get done meeting with God, that he would come out and his face would be shining so bright because he had been in the presence of God that Moses actually had to wear a veil to cover his face because people are like, whoa, okay, can't handle that. He had to cover his face in this veil because he had been in the presence of God. And that's the type of thing that we see here up on this mountain. Jesus goes up with Peter and James and John. And as he's up there, all of a sudden, this glory of God starts shining through him. His clothes become radiant white. His face begins shining. It's like the veil of Christ's humanity has been lifted, and they're starting to be able to see the glory of his divinity. And the disciples are just awed at what they're seeing. I'm sure it reminds them of some of the prophecies of Ezekiel and Daniel about seeing the Son of Man and how he just shone so bright. And that's what they're experiencing. Suddenly Moses and Elijah appeared, and they began talking with Jesus. We're told in the book of Luke that when Moses and Elijah appeared and they were talking with Jesus, they were talking with him about his exodus, his crucifixion to come. So they're kind of laying a game plan for the second half of his ministry here, and they're getting him ready to go to the cross. And Peter exclaimed, Lord, it's wonderful for us to be here. Again, the book of Luke says Peter had no idea what he was saying. He was like totally out of his mind. But he says, Lord, it's wonderful for us to be here. If you want, I'll make 3 shelters as memorials, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. What's the importance of Moses and Elijah? I mean, Moses, the one through whom God delivered the law and said, a prophet like you will come in my name. And Elijah, who is the embodiment of the prophets that talked about the coming of the Messiah, that's why they're there. He's a fulfillment of the law and the prophets, and they're there preparing him for the end. But even as he spoke, A bright cloud overshadowed them. You know, God likes mountains and God likes clouds. If you go through the Old Testament, as the Israelites were wandering through the wilderness, God said this. He said, I'm going to be a cloud for you. I'll be a pillar of fire at night. I'll be a cloud in the daytime so you know where to go. Moses built the tabernacle after he got done sanctifying the tabernacle, purifying the tabernacle. A cloud from heaven came and filled the tabernacle. The glory of God was there. After Solomon had built the temple and purified it, a cloud from heaven came and filled the temple, representing the glory of God being there. And here up on this mountain where Jesus has just stripped away some of his humanity to be able to show his divinity, a cloud comes, representing the presence of God. And in this cloud there was a voice, and it said this is my dearly loved son who brings me great joy. Listen to him. This is my dearly loved son who brings me great joy. Exact wordings of Jesus at his baptism. That first chapter of his ministry, where God reaffirms to John what you guys are about ready to start doing, what you're about ready to do in setting this plan in motion of showing my son to be the Messiah. This is him. He's my son. I love him. And now here, this next chapter of we've identified who he is, and now we're going to work on what he's going to do. God reaffirms to the disciples, this is my son. I love him. Make sure you do what he says. That's coming from that prophecy in Deuteronomy 18 where God says, I'll send a prophet like you, Moses, who's going to speak on my behalf, and people better listen to him. The disciples were terrified and they fell face down on the ground. And then Jesus came over and he touched them. Get up, he said, don't be afraid. And when they looked up, Moses and Elijah were gone, and they saw only Jesus. As they went back down the mountain, Jesus commanded them, don't tell anyone what you've seen until the Son of Man has raised from the dead. Why would he say, don't tell anyone what you've seen? I mean, I think there's a couple of reasons. First of all, I think he's saying, hey, don't run back to the other guys and let them know what you saw. There may be some jealousy there. They may not totally understand what's going on, okay? Don't tell people that you saw me and my divinity because people still don't understand the purpose of my being here. It wasn't to reveal Jesus as who he was, because that's taken place. The disciples got it. It was for him to go to the cross. And if their disciples were around going, we know this is the Messiah. We saw him. He was all shiny and bright. I mean, we heard a voice. It's really him. It may cause people to want to make him king even more, to make him their Messiah. But Jesus had to go to the cross. Then his disciples asked him, so why do the teachers of the religious law insist that Elijah must return before the Messiah comes? Jesus replied, Elijah is indeed coming first to get everything ready, but I tell you, Elijah's already come. But he wasn't recognized. They chose to abuse him. In the same way, they will also make the Son of Man suffer. Then the disciples realized he was talking about John the Baptist. And what Jesus is saying is, listen, Malachi prophesied that Elijah would come again. And no, it wasn't Elijah, the same guy that went up into heaven in a chariot of fire. It was John the Baptist who was fulfilling the role of Elijah. It was John the Baptist who came to prepare the way of the coming Messiah. He says the teachers of the law, other people, they didn't get it. They weren't putting two and two together to understand that this John the Baptist was actually a fulfillment of the prophecy about Elijah coming. They didn't get that. He said in the same way, they're not going to get me. You understand me to be the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God, but they're not. They don't get it. And because they don't get it, I'm going to suffer. And that started a whole new chapter for Jesus. Being reaffirmed by his Father that he still loved. Being reaffirmed that he still has the voice of his Father to teach his disciples. Being reaffirmed that he's got his disciples' attention, understanding that, hey, this is going to end not good for me on a cross, but 3 days later I will rise from the dead. Are you in it with me? It was a whole new chapter. And so what about us? Like I said, there's a whole bunch of stuff we hear about Jesus. And maybe we've got to a point where we're like, okay, yeah, I kind of believe Jesus is God's son. I'm good with that. Have we really laid down our life for him? We know he laid his life down for us. But how many of us just want to give some lip service to God, hoping that that saves us for eternity while still trying to hold on to everything this world has? Jesus says, if you want to hold on to what the world has, you're going to lose your life. If you lose your life for my sake, if you die to yourself for my sake, you'll gain your life for all of eternity. And so we have a choice to make. This little section's really kind of interesting. Because when you read Matthew chapter 3 and 4, that's the baptism of Jesus and the temptation of Jesus. That's the first kind of chapter in Jesus' ministry. We read how Jesus came into the wilderness and went to John, and as he stepped into the water and he was baptized and he came out of the water, the dove came down, and a voice from heaven called out, "This is my son in whom I am well pleased." And then he went into the wilderness, where for 40 days and 40 nights you had Satan saying, hey, why don't we just shortcut this whole ministry thing? I know you're hungry. Why don't you just turn some of these stones to bread? I know you want people to believe in you. Why don't you just jump off the temple and do that? Why don't you just bow down to me and I'll give you whatever you want? And Jesus resisted and Satan fled. And then you read here in chapter 16 and 17, almost the exact same story, just reversed. Here you have Peter saying, hey, I know you're the Messiah, but you don't need to go to the cross. That's not going to happen to you. And Jesus saying, just get behind me, because that's where I'm going. And then he goes up on a mountain where he's reaffirmed by his Father that this is my son whom I love. I'm well pleased with him. Listen to him. And it gave him all the encouragement and energy and everything he needed, the reaffirmation, to start the march down that mountain towards another mountain in Jerusalem. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this account of your son. And Jesus, I know there's a ton more that took place when you were up on that mountain that we didn't have time to tackle here. But what I pray, what I ask that we do understand is not just who you were, the glory of your divinity shining through the veil of your humanity, not just that, but we understand why you came and what you require of us. You had to go to the cross. You had to die and you had to raise from the dead, because that was the price of our salvation. And if we want to follow you, we have to deny ourselves, to take up our cross and follow. So Jesus, give us the wholehearted devotion to you that you had to your Father. It's in your name I pray. Amen. So here's the point. We have a choice. We're all facing it. And the choice is this: whether to entrust our life to Jesus and save it, or attempt to preserve our life and end up losing it. It's a choice you got to make. If If you've not made that choice, if you've not surrendered yourself to the Lordship of Christ, I want to talk to you afterwards. I'd love to pray with you, love to talk to you about what steps are required in dying to yourself and taking up that cross. If you've done that, if you've declared allegiance to Christ, you've said, I'm all in, Jesus is the Lord of my life, I believe that he is the Son of God, I believe he's the Christ, I believe that, then just ask yourself, are you living like that? Are you following Jesus with as much heart and devotion as he had in going to the cross for you? Let's stand. We're going to close with this final passage coming out of Daniel. Daniel chapter 7, verses 9 and 10 says this. It says, while I was watching, thrones were set up, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His attire was white like snow. His hair, or the hair of his head, was like lamb's wool. His throne was ablaze with fire, and its wheels were all aflame. River of fire was stretching forth and proceeding from his presence. Many thousands were ministering to him. Many tens of thousands stood ready to serve him. The court convened. The books were opened. That day is coming. Let's make sure as we go about this week as a church, as River Run Christian Church out in our community, that we're loving God, loving others, and sharing God's love. You guys have a great week, and I'll see you next week. Thank you for joining our service. We sincerely pray that it has drawn you closer in your walk with Christ, and that it's encouraged you to face whatever may lay before you. If you need someone to walk alongside you, please don't hesitate to reach out to us here at River Run. God bless you, and we hope that you join us next time.